Great. Well, let's get started then. So, Nick Jenkinson, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Johnny. Good to be here.
Yeah, bit of a. I did wonder whether we were going to both make it today. Bearing in mind, A, it's early in the morning. B, it's snowing, and it doesn't take much more than like a couple of leaves on the line to.
No, it actually all went pretty well. Albeit, I do feel a bit of a drown rat walking in the rain this morning. But yeah, all good. Managed to get here, and the British infrastructure has stood up to this tiny piece of snow that we've had.
It held up. Are you normally kind of a morning person?
Yeah, massively. I think that's changed over time. Actually, I've always been the late nights and early mornings, and I'm still good at the late nights if it's more of a socialising. I think from a work point of view, my brain starts to close down the later it go, and I'd much rather than switch off and then get up early and crack on with things. So yeah, it's a problem of getting old, I think, is that the sleep hours are slightly different than what they once were. And I've got 2 young kids as well. So
I think
they definitely influence it.
That's the difference, I think. So, because you do quite a bit of running, don't you?
Wow. Yes, the people who have followed me on LinkedIn will have seen that I was doing a charity challenge, which was to do 20 half marathons, 3 marathons, and 2 endurance events. So it was based on 2023, so it was 2, 2, and 3.
Oh, right, okay.
And so I am on with that. I've had probably a bad couple of months, I would say. So it's I'm planning on getting back on actually next week. So to be able to complete that challenge before the end of the year. So I've already done, what have I already done? So I've already done 1 of the marathons. I've done 3 half marathons. I've done 2 endurance events. I need to get back up to speed and start cracking on for this year.
And is that something you normally do in the mornings?
Depends, actually. It depends where I am. I'm probably, even though I would tell people to ensure they get that balance from when I'm working and leisure time, and I do actually, and one of my ex-team members knows this really well, and I mentioned it on LinkedIn recently, and he did say, who were you talking about? Because he knew exactly who I was talking about. I have a lot of my probably good ideas when I am running and you're doing something else. I'm quite a big believer your brain obviously goes to a different place. I'm also quite deadly at then just switching my laptop on very early in the morning and then getting caught up in the day-to-day. So when I'm away, I'm pretty good at it, actually. So with my family have got a house in Portugal, and when I'm there, I'm really good at getting up early in the morning, going for a run, and on holidays, it's just where you create that time. So it's probably a good lesson for me moving forward in terms of making sure I do create that time, because otherwise I can get caught up in the hustle bustle of the day before you know it. Yeah,
it's difficult. I tend to find with the exercise stuff that I do, which is varied, I have to do it first thing.
Yeah.
And if I think I'm just going to quickly check something on my laptop first, it's almost like game over at that point. You just get caught up in everything. But yeah, I can cope with an early morning. But so procurement transformation, some topics around that we're going to discuss today. Kind of talking about navigating the journey, extracting maximum value. But there's a couple of key areas that I want to drill into with you. Just in terms of talking about your background, interestingly, we were chatting earlier about the fact that we realised we both worked within the GMGT group at the same time back in the day.
We did indeed. Yeah. Small world.
Yeah, exactly. But you've worked across quite a few different sectors.
Yep. I have that strange CV of 7 industries, 7 companies who I've worked for. So. And
you've done direct and indirect.
Yep. So I started off probably first half of my career fully in directs, and second half predominantly in indirects. And obviously it changes, because obviously having done some work in financial services recently, directs in financial services, indirects in other industries in terms of your operations and print, etc.
It's really interesting, isn't it? It's like, as a tech vendor in the procurement space, you're always trying to clearly define what you do.
Yeah.
To when you look at like the Kearney market map and all the different procurement technology, they're so confusing, and you just think, oh my God, there's so much technology out there. Where does it all fit in? So you're constantly trying to leverage industry definitions, and they're just not that firm in some ways in procurement. I mean, like you say, even direct and indirect. I had Naveed Amin on the podcast recently, and working for a large engineering consultancy, like surveyors and things like that, working on High Speed 2 and all these different big projects. their their direct spend is all services.
Yeah.
And their indirect spend is where they're buying laptops and things like that.
And I had that earlier in my career where I worked for a BPO, but the predominant was around print, so it was very much that was the core delivery, and the indirects were managed very separately. So yeah, it's kind of, I guess I enjoy being involved in what drives the individual business, and therefore whether that be direct or indirect or how you term that. I started in the automotive industry, and it was all very much focused on keeping cars, building cars, ensuring that you kept that production line going. So it was a much broader, I would say, supply chain type role, and as a result, I think that probably stayed with me throughout my career. So you kind of want to be involved in the heartbeat of the organisation, what actually is keeping Exco up, what's keeping the board up, and being close to that, where and I don't necessarily think that that's a direct or indirect piece. It's just very much focused on what's important for this organisation and how can we influence that. So
yeah, it's easy for different departments and senior executives in some areas to lose sight of that.
Yep.
But ultimately, that's the only way a business is going to function effectively, if there is a clear strategy and it's communicated effectively, and then different areas of the business can understand how they're contributing to that specific strategy.
It is, and that's where I think probably be a little bit critical of us as a function in terms of procurement in general. I do think people get too hung up on, I want to be strategic and I don't want to be involved in tactical, etc. Because actually, depending on what your organisation needs, some of the most tactical things in the world could be the most strategic things in the world. If you're in a huge recession in a low margin organisation, going and making some tactical reductions which then can be sustainable for the long term can be very, very strategic. And so I think we kind of get too hung up on, it's really important that you look at your own business strategy and you look at what is our business trying to deliver and focus on that, because you can bring in, take technology as a good example, you can bring in lots of all singing, all dancing technologies, but if your business don't care about it, then what's the point, is the reality. And so I think you've really got to focus, and I did a separate conversation with someone recently, and I really made that point where I do think we get too hung up, and everybody, it's really obvious to say that, of course, I'm aligning everything with what the business objectives are, but I don't think people do in reality. I think people have their own vested interest in terms of what they want to do, how they want to be perceived, how they want to be perceived in the marketplace, how they want to be perceived within their own organisation. And sometimes some of the more mundane activities can be probably less appealing and less attractive, but actually, if that's what the business needs, then actually you've got to get those things right, and they're the hygiene factor that you really need to focus on doing well, and then you can start to build into the exciting, more sexier activities that you can deliver within the organisation. But you've got to take the people on that journey. They've got to see where the need is for that. I mean, I always say to people, I think my role is about repositioning and reimagining ultimately, and then getting the buy-in from people. So it's where should procurement be positioned? Let's reimagine that role, and then let's go sell it into senior organisation. And once you've done that, and then put the enablers in place for the team to be able to deliver within that positioning, things start to run much more smoothly. And that's obviously taking the transformation point where you can start to stand back and actually start to move that into more of a ongoing evolution as opposed to a huge revolution.
Yeah, and I think if a procurement function are trying to make change and trying to transform, but they're not taking it from a start point of focusing what the business objectives are, then you just end up with like a big disconnect. And you see it sometimes in organisations where they've done, like, spent a lot of money on bringing a big piece of technology in, but it hasn't fit with what the rest of the organisation wants to do, and they don't get adoption.
But I think it's a much, much bigger problem than people will admit, because the reality is, it's obvious to say. I mean, no one's going to ever, any event you go to, anyone you're ever going to talk to, everyone's always going to say, I align with our business objectives. I just don't think people often do, because they try and push their own objectives onto the business. But if you've got a business who aren't taking that on, or you're not positioning it right, or you're not selling it right, and exactly that, the technology, I can't remember the actual figures, but I remember doing a presentation on how many digital transformations fail and it's in your 70-80%, but when we go to different events and people are showing how great implementations they've had and how they're using the technology amazingly well, nobody talks about the 70-80%.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the core focus, where you've really got to look at what problem am I trying to solve? How do I solve that problem? And then how do you put the technology over the top, as opposed to too many people start with the tech and then try and work out what the problem is, as opposed to start with the problem and then work out how to do it. Is it just a process change? Is it a people change? Or actually, can we digitize? I guess in the world we live in today, most problems will have a digital element to some extent. But I guess what I'm a good believer in is building the foundation first, building whatever process relates to it, and then get the technology to fit within that, as opposed to doing it the other way around.
Yeah, as I think I've heard you say before, ultimately, if you automate a bad process.
Yeah, I remember it's because that came from I don't know, it must be 6-7 years ago. We did a tour of India in terms of we were looking for some BPO activities and technology providers at the time, and people were really, really happy to show you. Obviously, RPAs were really starting to accelerate, and there was AI tools starting to come in, and people really wanted to show you the art of the possible. But there was quite often you did just look at it and you thought, well, you just automated a terrible process. But I can tell that is a terrible process, whichever way you look at it. So it was almost, they were showing it to be proud of, look at what we've done in digitizing this, but it was still a bit of a mess.
Yeah, it can kind of miss the point a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And it was quite interesting, just the different perceptions.
Yeah. So if you look at the different areas you've worked in pharmaceutical, media, obviously now finance with Santander, on the food side of it, automotive you mentioned. What would you say are the key things that have influenced that trajectory in your career so far?
What, in terms of going across different industries?
Yeah, what's been the kind of themes or things that have pulled you into different situations or pushed you in a particular direction? Are there any particular things that have mainly influenced it, whether that's...
Not to be what industries I've gone into. So I've never really gone into anything saying I'd like to go work in this industry or I'd like to work in that industry. I think it's more been timing, because the opportunities have come up. The challenge is the critical thing for me. It's actually, is there a real challenge that I can get my teeth stuck into where I can really make a difference? I mean, we were talking earlier when we were both at DMG, that was my first head of role, and it was a transformation role. And the reality is, at that point, I had limited indirect experience, and clearly in media, it's an industry that is predominantly indirect focus. So luck came into that at the end of the day. I just got a good rapport with the hiring manager at the time. He gave the opportunity, saw something in me. I probably had quite a big imposter syndrome, I guess, when you first went into it, because it was your first sort of senior leadership role, and you've got we ended up creating a strong team, and you bring in a lot of category expertise and industry expertise, and so you obviously at that point think, well, what's my role, and how do I find my own position within this? And two of those people still work with me now. So in terms of they've been working with me very recently, and one's still working with me now, and have now worked across different industries. But it was obviously takes some time, I think, from a leadership perspective, that you have to find, what is my role within this? How do I start to drive value? Because I'm not the expert in this IT category, I'm not the expert in this marketing category, but the business didn't need me to be, and that's not what they recruited me to do. So I do think sort of finding those opportunities. I know people say you make your own luck, and I guess I obviously did a reasonable job there and spent a number of years, and we won a number of awards there. But the reality is, that first interview and when I got recruited into that role, I didn't have the background necessarily that the perfect candidate would have had.
Right.
So it was good that you built the rapport, you built that credibility, and then it was all about building the credibility once you were in the door, and how do we go deliver, and making sure you had those quick wins.
But looking at some of the stuff you've done, there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's quite a heavy focus on the transformation side.
Yeah.
So you're not a status quo guy.
No.
So is that something that's kind of pulled you through the different roles you've done? Because ultimately, transformations are ongoing, but there's a big chunk of work to do. Is that the bit that really kind of interests you?
I mean, so if I just kind of go through the different roles, the one we talked about in media, that was a good example where I'd kind of done everything I could within that organisation. I was there for best part of 5 years. As I said, I went on my own learning curve, learned a lot about technology. So I was the second person in the UK to sign up for Cooper, and we did a Cooper implementation there. It actually got held up, the implementation, slightly, just because of other business change things that were happening in the organisation. You were part of that organisation, you'll probably recognise some of those. But actually, we then implemented Cooper, and so, but at the point I'd been there 5 years, there was nowhere else to go. I was working for the COO, and when he moved on, working for the CFO at the time, there was no real sort of upwards progression, and that's when I looked for that next challenge. And then similarly, when I was in the pharma organisation, we did some great transformation. I actually did 3 different areas and 3 different roles there, because I did procurement and real estate and finance shared services.
Oh, right.
So I kind of, so for me, it was almost like every 18 months I took on a new challenge. So I was there 5 years, but also came out of the procurement space to manage all of our real estate across Europe, and then took on all of shared services as well. So it was kind of a good learning curve where procurement was one of 3 avenues. But again, it got to a point when we globalized that was certain ambitions I had, and for a variety of reasons they didn't come off, and therefore as a result it was, okay, where's my next challenge? And actually probably always had wanted to stay in a permanent FTE type role. I always wanted to own and grow, never really had the interest in doing consultancy, never really had the interest in doing advisory. And then at Santander, it's been an advisory role to sort of drive the transformation there. And actually, whether it's COVID, whether it's getting a bit older, I've enjoyed that element of it. And I think I've probably become more philosophical about where companies get the most value from me. And it is probably in that first sort of 12 to 18 months where you can do significant disruption. Certainly wouldn't say it's a cookie cutter approach, because what we've done in Santander was different to what we did in Stellus and different to what we did in the media organisation. But I do think there are a lot of similarities, and therefore in terms of bringing those accelerators and those enablers in order to be able to hit the ground running quickly, I guess what I probably don't think I need is 6 months to understand the organisation. I think I can probably quite rapidly understand what the challenges are, try, and then obviously that's the point, you've then got to get the senior management buy-in. Here's your problem, here's where I think you need to solve it, and actually coming back to that repositioning, reimagining, and then getting the senior buy-in. And so that's kind of, I think it's been a good couple of years for me to think about what it is that I'm good at, what's my focus, what am I not so good at is the reality, because it's also, I think I'm probably very self-aware, and I know what my strengths are, but I also know what my weaknesses are, and I'm quite a big fan of focusing on your strengths and being really good at your strengths, as opposed to trying to be great at everything. What I try to do is surround myself with great people who help my weaknesses. Ultimately, surround yourself with that diversity, because those people can bring what you don't have. And me trying to sort of constantly force myself as a square peg into a round hole, I certainly can adapt and I certainly can be flexible, but it's where you're strongest and where you get most impact, and therefore how do I really focus on those strengths and try and really magnify those as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that always strikes me as a way to leverage yourself most effectively. You know, if you're concentrating on adding the most value that you possibly can, and then you're surrounding yourself with people that complement the whole picture. Yeah,
and in all those roles, because obviously I've then changed teams, built teams, we've always done some sort of personality profiling to look at what the organisation looks like, and we've used insights a number of times, because I think the colour aspect is very easy for people to understand, but I'm pretty much off the scale, red and yellow, so it's that creative driver, and that's kind of the focus, and that's why I've always found it interesting to do as a team, because you always obviously don't want to ensure that you're not just recruiting by type, and you end up with all these crazy people who just want to drive everything and come up with creative ideas, but actually who's focusing on the people, who's focusing on the data. And it's certainly that it's not that I can't do those aspects, and obviously people are a critical element and data is a critical element, and I can certainly go down into that detail. It's more about where are you most comfortable, where do you get most energy, and it's certainly for me it's that those reds and yellows, which is obviously massive in a transformation, and a massive in a transformation in the first 12 to 18 months when you're really throwing everything in the air, the balls are all coming down, and then you're trying to reassess everything.
Yeah, and I think you almost kind of have to put your ego aside in terms of just delegating out and trying to hire people that are basically better than you, trying to make yourself obsolete to a certain extent.
Yeah. I'm a massive believer in that. I mean, to go back to the pharmaceutical industry, pretty much that's where we got to, in that we got a team who made my life really easy, and the amount of change that was possible within the organisation because of other changes that were happening slowed. And so I got into a very, very cushy place. And actually, I remember having the conversation about, well, actually, let's agree some sort of exit based on that. And it was very much one of my focuses. It's not good for the company and it's not good for me if I'm in that cushy place, because I'm quite strong on the stress versus performance curve, so I kind of need quite a lot of
work well under pressure.
Yeah, I'm the person who gets the presentation done a minute before it needs to be. I'm the one who at my MBA dissertation I stayed up for 36 hours.
I'm a little bit the same myself. I know what you mean.
So, but I do thrive. Obviously, it creates issues for those around you, and obviously I've tried to change that as I've evolved over time, and you won't want to put that pressure because it's good for me, it's not good for other people. And I have worked in organisations where there were probably 2 or 3 of us like that, and as a result we got a lot delivered and we all got on really well, but it can create chaos for everyone else around you. So yeah, it's really that sort of focus on how do I then drive things forward.
Yeah, and I think it takes a certain type of certain type of personality and skills and attributes to come into a problem situation and to be able to effectively assess what that problem statement is for that organisation and encapsulate that, and then go ahead and work on building the solution and putting the solution in place and getting that moving. But if you're the type of person that can do that, and you're then very happy to then delegate it out, build the team that can support it and take it forward without thinking, I always want to be here, I always want to be part of this, not necessarily needing to be the primary driver. It does lend itself quite well to that more interim advisory type scenario.
And I guess that's more where I've come to the realization in terms of what I'm looking for going forward. As I said, you've obviously I think COVID probably changed a lot of us in terms of how we live our life, how we want to live our life moving forward. Certainly when I was in the pharma organisation, spent a lot of time on aeroplanes. My BA Gold is still with me from the time doing that. But ultimately, I've also got 2 little kids, and you want to be at home as much as possible, and now get to see a lot more. I was at one of their performances last night, and there's another one Friday morning, but being able to do that is obviously quite critical. And so I think the advisory piece, and given that's always been my mentality anyway, I've never been somebody who's sort of fearful of bringing great people in. I'm a big fan of you're as good as the people around you, and if you don't bring great people in, then ultimately it's never going to be successful. And so it's more about how do I give them, as I said, that positioning, how do I give them the right enablers, how do I develop them and give them constant feedback in terms of how they can develop. But once you get that strength and depth there, your life becomes a lot easier. And I guess weirdly, the position you just talked about of where something's not in a great position, I sort of thrive on that. So you thrive on, this really isn't great, and then have the confidence to back myself that I'll be able to make an impact and make that difference. And obviously some of that's come with experience, some of that's just come with time where you've got more confidence in your own capabilities. Like I said, I definitely, when I've had that media role, which would have been 14 years ago when I first went into it, definitely there was a level of imposter syndrome of, what am I actually going to do within this? Because you're better than me at this, and you're better than me at this. And actually just finding your footing. As I said, 2 of those people have been working with me recently, so I must have done something right at the time, because they're still stupid enough to come back and work with me again.
Well, I think when you're going through these, if you're the type of person that's got an appetite to approach these tricky problems and try and put solutions in place and work through it, the people that are working with you are going to have a huge learning experience. So that's going to take people along. And like you say, when the team gets to a certain level, you're almost not needed. They if you bring in the really good competencies, they can take that forward, and you can move on to what's the next big problem. If if that's the thing that, I'd say that's fairly rare in terms of that being the thing that floats your boat and gets you motivated.
I like complexity and I like change, and I like being able to take that complexity and turn it into something different. As I said, I never thought I would be positioning that actually I want to do more advisory type activities, but actually that's exactly where I am currently in terms of what I'm sort of looking for and conversation I'm having about then what the future looks like. I've sort of said I'll never say never on permanent roles, but I think that's definitely what floats my boat more at the moment.
Cool. So talking about complexity, when we're addressing digital transformation within procurement, you've got the digital side of it, or let's just call it procurement transformation.
Yep.
You've got the digital side of it, and then you've got the people side of the transformation. So we discussed earlier the fact that you need to understand where the business is going. You need to make sure you're lining up with the strategy. But when you're trying to balance out that kind of people transformation, a digital transformation, firstly, what do the 2 different things mean to you? And secondly, how do you feel it's most appropriate to try and balance that?
So I think digital transformation, people get very hung up on this in terms of what's digital for one organisation is very different to what's digital for another organisation, because
right.
If you're a SME, low margin, you've probably had lots of manual processes, and actually just having any form of technology is digitisation. If you are a huge pharmaceutical organisation, you're very much in the world of how we automating as much as possible, how we then bring in AI tools in to be able to provide, to augment the data and the activities that we're carrying out. So I think there isn't an easy answer of what digital transformation looked like. It's all about, for me, it's how we're using tech enablers to enable transformation within the organisation. And I think from a people point of view, I'm quite a big fan of looking at it, it's not just about organisation, it's not just about the capabilities of the people, it's that whole operation model, it's the capabilities of the people, but it's also the ways of working, it's the interactions, it's how that whole ecosystem works together. And I think that's where the 2 need to come in play, and sometimes you need to have the technology in order for the operating model to work effectively. I mean, we've definitely had examples of that where we designed the operating model of what the end state would look like, but we couldn't actually make some of the changes until the technology enablers were put in place, because the roles became a different type of role of what you actually was needed in the future. So I think they go hand in hand, and I think you really have to look at it from what works best from a planning point of view, but also you have business strategy, you have business constraints, you have funding constraints, you have all the different things that go with transformation. I don't think I've ever been anywhere where you walk in and everybody says, here's a empty open treasure chest, please take as much as you want and go and spend what you want, and then just tell us when you finish. Ultimately, it's all about, like I said, it's that reposition, reimagining, but to do that you need the technology, and sometimes that's planned, sometimes it's opportunistic. So in one of my roles, we had a major, it was back in pharmaceutical days, TPRM became a real burning platform for the organisation, and as a result, even though at the time it wasn't my number 1 priority, it became the number 1 priority, and we were able to really build some good capability and be quite opportunistic in that we got a 7-figure funding request approved because we did have the burning platform within the organisation, and really we built a real strong capability in third-party risk off the back of that. When I first went in, it wasn't in the top 3 of these are the things we were going to do, but it soon became number 1, and then we built that capability up. So I also think you can have the best plan in the world, but sometimes different things happen in the environment, and obviously that's never been truer as it has been in the last few years in terms of
absolutely
whether it's COVID, whether it's inflation, whether it's interest rates. There's obviously a huge amount of change, and I think what's important now is really having a clear operating model, a clear foundation, and then being able to build on that and adapt and be agile within it, as opposed to something which ends up like a cruise liner trying to turn that. I just don't think that works anymore. So it's really about, where do we think the world's going to go? Where do we think the organisation's going to go? Let's build the right capabilities within our operating model to do that. But actually in 2 years, that will probably need to evolve further because things have moved on, or we've got things wrong. I mean, ultimately, don't think I've ever done one of these transformations where every single decision I've made has been perfect and we've got everything right, because you don't. It's making that sort of level of change is a challenge, and you get the 80% right, but you'll have the 20% and you'll have the challenges with people in the organisation, and therefore you have to just continue to evolve.
Yeah,
which I think, actually, coming back to it, given you used to work in the same media organisation, that was a great learning for me, because that was not an easy organisation to work in. Being procurement in a media organisation is not simple.
They're all about last minute, something's changed.
Yeah. And ultimately it was all about either getting newspapers out or getting content out.
Yeah.
It was really focused. So things like policy, things like process, obviously just didn't really matter, because as you know, we had the different sides of the organisation, whether it be digital, whether it be in newspaper format. But it was a really good learning for me of actually building the relationships, building credibility through delivery, as opposed to trying to build it through some sort of mandate, because you would have never ever got it in that organisation anyway. And even if you got it, nobody would have ever listened to you. So it was all about, how are we driving value? Why actually do you want to work with us? Because actually we can bring some really great things for you. And I think we went on that. And it was probably the things you got involved in was very interesting. I negotiated paparazzi deals within that, which was I've never done again. So it was a very interesting environment.
Yeah, well, it's like you say about the kind of the complexity of the procurement transformation doesn't just affect procurement.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at the people change required, it's not just procurement people, it's stakeholders, it's suppliers even.
Yeah.
You're putting in that kind of behavioural changes potentially. And the same from a digital point of view, in the sense that the technology needs to make sense within that organisation's wider infrastructure.
Well, that is why I guess procurement is quite interesting, because there isn't that many areas of a business that touch everything and you get oversight of everything. So finance to an extent, obviously HR, but I think you really, from a commercial point of view, do get to touch and feel most of the organisation, and as a result of that, most of the organisation will have an opinion.
Yeah.
The reality as well, because you've got quite a core group who you're interacting with, and so being able to focus on that perception, even if it's not a reality. I'm quite a big believer in, even if we think things are going great and we measure data and it says it's going great, if there's a perception that things aren't, then you need to take that on board and you need to look at how do we evolve things. And I think that only makes you better as well, because if you already know you're doing the right things and the data shows, but somebody's not seeing it, actually it focuses your mind on, right, what are we getting wrong? Why is this not landing? And how can I improve that moving forward? So again, weirdly, challenging stakeholders can be a very positive thing, because I do think they focus your attention on, why am I here? What am I here to deliver? What can the team deliver? How can we do this better? And how do we sort of evolve that offering?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I want to come on to data in a bit, but I think when you talk about the influence of procurement within the different parts of the organisation and touching different parts of the business, I think procurement's an interesting and very strategic, has a kind of strategic fulcrum within the business, like a kind of, it's pivotal because of the information that's going through procurement. I mean, it depends how well that information is captured, but you've got information on what's happening within the organisation.
Yeah.
what your organisation thinks of your supply chain. You've also got the information coming in from your supply chain as to how they're interacting with the organisation and their views of what's happening within your organisation, as well as on, from their own point of view, what they're doing. So, and I think just in terms of where you can capture the relevant amount of data, it's a very powerful position in terms of you're at
this. But you've got to use it, haven't you? Because then that's why a lot of people in procurement get into that whole boring. I want a seat at the table, we should have a seat at the table. And even COVID, lots of people kind of went through, well, it's never been a better time to work in procurement, which I don't disagree, because obviously supply chains became critical at that time, but it's what you do within that. And I think all the things you're saying are exactly right, yet there are countless procurement organisations out there that are not set up very well, that aren't doing those things. And I think it all comes back to that whole where you're positioned, what's the messaging you're selling, how are we driving that value, and what does that look like, and trying to move away from this, I'm a policeman and I'm going to stop you doing things, because that's just not the world we live in anymore. There's a relevant need to have some controls, but those controls need to be proportional, and they need to be based on what the needs of this specific organisation. But yeah, I mean, I think the way you described it is exactly the way that you would want a procurement organisation to work, in that you are fully ingrained in everything from a stakeholder point of view, and then you're managing that supplier ecosystem, and you're joining the dots together to say, this is what the business needs are, this is what the supply chain can offer, and this is what that happy marriage between the two, and actually how do we then drive more value from that.
Yeah, and I'm sure you must have seen plenty of commonalities across the different sectors and the different organisations you've worked in, but I'm interested to know, from your point of view, when you look at things like the balance of cost versus risk, that must look quite different in different organisations. Like, for example, in the finance sector, the risk profile.
Same, and in pharmaceutical, I would say. So the risk is obviously, because both are heavy regulated industries, risk is obviously really important. So if I actually probably open, I would say from a third-party risk, my capabilities have grown exponentially over the last 7 years because of the burning platform that we talked about in previous organisation, and then obviously working in financial services, which is heavily regulated. So whereas, I don't know, if you work in, let's take the media example, you work in media, you work in FMCG, it's much more about, okay, we know what the risks are, but we're going to manage those risks appropriately. And quite often with third-party risk, for example, in other industries, I don't think it's ever a problem until it is a problem.
Yeah.
Because people kind of go, well, yeah, we know, but is that really going to happen? And then when it does happen, which is obviously what has happened more, and that's why I think it's massively grown in importance in most organisations. Starting in automotive, risk was obviously a big thing, because it was all about, we need the safety aspect in terms of actually we're building quality, safe cars, but secondly, as much as anything, are the parts on that production line when we need to build cars, and actually how are we managing that supply chain, which obviously the complexity in that, I mean, it was a long time ago I was in the industry, but the complexity in that in the last 2 to 3 years, and anybody who's been trying to buy a new car will know very well that obviously that's just been a hugely challenging organisations and environment, because of all the semiconductor issues and just ongoing supply chain challenges, where people have really had to think about, actually, how are we going to just totally reimagine the way we do this, because this isn't working, and actually how we looking at the end-to-end supply chain as much as possible.
It's slight tangent, but just you raise an interesting point there. So when you were within the automotive sector, because it's more heavily predicated, pardon me, towards the direct side of it and materials and goods.
Yeah.
I always think of that as having the actual thing that you're buying is simpler, but the supply chain is generally much more complex. Versus in a banking scenario, you're going to be mainly buying services, indirect.
Yeah.
Quite possibly.
I don't think it's the thing is simpler. I think there'll be a lot of automotive engineers out there who would probably disagree with you.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say the simplicity in, for example, a semiconductor, but you know what it is.
Yeah.
The definition of
I think
the
it's
thing
more
you're buying.
about it's your stakeholder management, which becomes very different. I guess when I was in automotive, everybody worked with procurement because that you were an integrated part of the business. Everything was done cross-functionally. and we were very much focused on what is the specific value of a good or service, and that's what we're prepared to pay that, and it was all very transparent. I think when you go into, use that media example, people don't, or perception would be we don't have to go work with procurement, and therefore I'll just go off and do my own thing. And so actually that how do you bring people with you? How do people then see the value? It's just a very, very different approach, and it's, again, it comes back to that sort of where you're positioned in the organisation, and if you're indispensable, then you're indispensable. I think it's just in some industries, you're naturally indispensable just because of the nature of the industry, nature of a huge part of your cost base in the car industry is based on goods and services, and therefore you have a huge impact within the organisation. And so I think it's looking at that positioning and how do we really start to drive that. But as I said, the risk element in the supply chain has clearly become a massive factor in the last 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at automotive versus financial, for example, you're going to be buying more things in the automotive sector, and therefore I feel like that's a more evolved part of the procurement process in some ways, because it's easier to define and measure what it is you're actually buying.
And it was very mature 20 years ago, because ultimately it was, I was more than 20 years ago that I started working in that, and it was a very mature area at that point in time, so it matured earlier and therefore kind of has maintained that level of maturity.
Yeah, whereas it feels like some of the service areas, like whether marketing or consulting, whatever, are coming more and more under procurement control now. And I feel like there's maybe a bit of an evolution where procurement are becoming more towards that indispensable end of the scale when you're dealing with other parts of the supply chain that maybe weren't so much before.
I think it depends on your organisation. It depends on how successful you've been in that. I think you can speak to lots of people who are going to say yes, and you speak to lots of people just who bang their head against the wall on a day-to-day basis, particularly in some of the areas you talked about. Marketing's always it's kind of it's building that relationship, and it's obviously it's a different mindset you would need to have, because any person who's looking at marketing procurement and goes in and says I'm going to save you some money and then you'll have less budget is obviously looking at it totally wrong, because the focus is absolutely on return on investment, and actually how are we driving more value how are we driving more return for the money that we're spending. And that's where it's really getting that relationship, which is obviously different than other areas where it may be simply, we want to manage the cost base and we want to manage it effectively. So I think it's all about the adaptation and the skill set you need, and how do you then influence people, and how do you gain that credibility.
Yeah, and it just goes back to what you're saying earlier about you can't necessarily have a one-size-fits-all approach, in terms of whether it's cost cutting or trying to demonstrate value and increase return investment. It's not just one solution across the board.
No, and it's and that's what I said. There are similarities, absolutely, and there are elements across different industries, but different drivers in different industries are totally when and whether it's being like FMCG, obviously the key is being first to market, and actually how are you helping produce that. So when I was working in FMCG, we had a big capital program, and some of the supplier conversations we were having were not about just buying bits of metal, they were about, or buying facilities. It was all about actually how can we get to market quicker, because we'll pay you more if we can get to market quicker. And actually how do we then go into some sort of quite complex commercial arrangements that really focus on driving product from our point of view, because it's product on shelves that we were looking for, as opposed to me sitting there arguing with you over 100,000 or 200,000 or 500,000, whatever that would be. So actually how do we change that relationship so that we become more collaborative, and actually our key driver is driving products that drives P&L, and therefore actually how do we get that same driver from a supplier and customer perspective.
It's business outcomes again, isn't it? Going back to the strategy. I thought it was interesting what you were saying about that classic thing of people, that slightly maybe a bit tired conversation about wanting a seat at the table, and that kind of perception of procurement being the police, because ultimately policing doesn't automatically mean that that's going to be in line with strategy. It could be just seen as a control element, which could be being led by procurement, but it might be hindering the actual overall strategy of the organisation, where maybe there needs to be a little bit more freedom, or things need to happen faster. And that's where I think with cost cutting as well, if you don't understand value, for organisations that don't understand value, they might be cutting off their nose to spite their face. They might be cutting out work that's actually delivering on the bottom line where they might not realise that.
Yeah, totally agree.
Cool. Okay, so another area I wanted to get your opinion on was just looking at it. So we looked at the kind of the value of the people side of the change. You can't just assume that the digital side of it's going to sort it all out for you.
Yeah.
But on the technology side, when you look at adoption of technology, so when you've mapped out where the business is going, how procurement can most suitably support that, and what that means in terms of what the procurement function needs to look like, how they need to operate, that operating model. When you've got to that point, when you look at bringing in different technologies, let's say you've got a base platform, you said you kind of like to have a solid base there. How do you see where the process should start and finish, bearing in mind the complexity of the procurement technology landscape now?
Well, I think with anything you would need to look end to end on the whole piece. So I guess I always look at it of what's that user journey and that experience. And even though that might not be one solution, it might be 6 different solutions. You need to see how that is all coming together and how do you start to manage that landscape from end to end. I think you're in a very dangerous situation if you just look at a specific technology, unless it's simply just, well, even then, if it's solving a specific problem, but even then it needs to have a level of integration. And I don't mean necessarily technology integration. It's all about, for me, it's the process integration, that it feels seamless. A good example was when we did that third-party risk solution in the pharma organisation. It was a different tool, different software provider, but from a user point of view, they didn't really know that. Because we made it quite simple what they had to do, so they were in and out of it pretty quick. And there was some bodies sat behind it who then made sure that data flowed from X to Y, and it wasn't necessarily the prettiest, because if we could have had the integration, but at the time there was funding constraints, there were infrastructure constraints with it, and so actually we had some bodies who were then making sure the whole thing kept moving effectively and the right data flowed from A to B. But from a user point of view, it felt like a clean process. It felt that talked to that, and it all went through end to end. So again, I think people get probably hung up of what's the perfect technology integration, which is great, but there's a lot of complexity comes with that, and I think and so it's really about how do we make sure that we provide that end to end user journey as cleanly as possible.
Yeah, again, it's about outcomes, isn't it? It's about not getting caught up in the kind of minutiae of the particular thing. It's like, how does that fit into the broader scenario we're talking about here? You might be looking at a piece of technology and going, well, the capability is there that we can do a really sophisticated integration with our source-to-pay platform, for example. But actually, if you want to get adoption and you want to get things happening quicker and you don't want to kind of upset other parts of the process, you might do something simpler to start with.
But that's where I think
facilitates it.
But I think that's where having the goal of what it is you're trying to achieve and having that business objective is really clear, is really important, because I've definitely seen examples where people lock themselves in a dark room and design a solution where it all kind of makes sense when you're on PowerPoint, because it'd be great if we could see data on this, and it'd be great if we could have that, and it'd be great if we could have that, and you get it, and then you end up seeing that it's 87 clicks before you can do anything.
Yeah.
And you sit there and go, well, no one's ever going to do this. So it all, and I've been involved in that. I mean, certainly early in my career, I can think of a very good example where we did that. It was literally like, but we'd like to get data on this, and we'd like to control that, and we'd like to get this, and it all sounds perfect, and I want an approval point here and an approval point there. But when you start actually going into it with real life scenarios, you're like, this is crazy, and this is going to take us forever to get anything done. And so I think really focusing on what it is we're trying to achieve, and therefore what compromises do we need to make as a result of that, and really how do we evolve that as well, because there will be certain things that you get in which don't quite work how you thought they were going to work when you were originally planning. So I think having that sort of piece on end to end, and I know we talked about it before, which is that this whole piece around best of breed versus sort of integrated solutions. I don't really believe the integrated solutions exist, to be honest. Certainly not on an end to end basis, and therefore everybody needs a level of best of breed, because there's no integrated solution out there that will solve every single problem that you have from a business point of view. So you now need to put together all this technology landscape, and there's some good, obviously, there's some great solutions coming in. I had an interesting conversation last week on a solution which is really a workflow solution, but really looking at sitting over the top of all of the different aspects and actually how are we driving that through. A lot of complexity as well. It gave me a bit of a headache thinking about actually some of the complexity that you would have associated with that. But the market is obviously going more and more. It's enhancing all the time. The level of automation, the level of intelligence within the solutions is increasing and increasing, and it's all about how do you actually use those, because it all still comes back to the people aspect, the systems, the technology, and I guess as a technology provider, take this in the right way. What I've seen with a lot of the newer technology providers is they know exactly how their technology works, they know exactly what problem they're trying to solve. How do you then bring that into a business and make sure it lands effectively and it marries together and all of the messaging comes right and it flows with other systems, I think is where people struggle slightly, which is where I said starting with the business problem and working backwards as opposed to starting with the technology and working forwards. And actually, it's that you can kind of see where that's the piece that's often missing. It's just actually I've got all of this landscape and you're going to solve this problem and you're going to do it really well because you've got a great solution, but how do I put it together with everything else I've got? Because like I said, it does, with some of it, it'll probably give you a headache just thinking about how you're actually going to bring that together and how that data is going to flow back and forth, and because otherwise you end up with it works great here, but then you've got no source of truth and the data doesn't flow effectively from end to end, and you're no further forward than what you are because you've solved this problem, but you've created lots of other problems further down the line. So I think having that bigger picture and trying to bring that business lens, and I think the other thing on that, again, if you start with the tech, I don't think people put enough time into that stuff either. They just go on the basis of somebody's told me I can implement it in 6 weeks, therefore I can get it implemented in 6 weeks, and then wonder why they haven't implemented in 6 weeks and where the challenges are. But it's because they never really looked at it as a part of a much bigger ecosystem and how this all fits together. Yeah,
I mean, it's definitely for the technology providers, the challenge is how do you get the best maximum value from what you're delivering to that specific end customer? And I think there's a lot more movement towards being very good at one specific thing, and keeping that simple, but then having really good capabilities around just how you kind of adapt the product for that sort of client, how you configure it for that particular customer, because really you need to understand the problem. So,
but that needs to sit on the business side as well, doesn't it? Because again, I think when you're going for a best of breed approach, I guess what you don't want probably is bringing in a huge SI for every single piece of tech that you're bringing in, because obviously from a cost point of view, it goes hugely. They probably don't have the capabilities either in the solution.
Probably not needed. Probably not needed.
But it's more about, but then you need the right skills. So talking about the operating model and talking about the capabilities, you need those people who can then in your own organisation think about these things, think about how it all marries together, and actually how do we join those dots together, because you're solving this problem, but it's all about the wider ecosystem and how that all fits together.
Yeah, I was reading an article that Lance Younger and Dr. Eloise Epstein had contributed towards this article recently, and Eloise was talking about stitching together these different solutions with a bit in the middle, and that bit in the middle is kind of one of those things that I feel like that's quite a rapid evolution that's happening at the moment in terms of what those things in the middle looks like, where you've got the traditional source to pay suites, for example, and then you've got new technologies coming in that kind of centralize ecosystems of different supplier tools.
And to be honest, I was with Lance last week when I was just talking about a second ago. So
right.
Yeah.
But Eloise was talking about that middle bit consisting of 4 things: user experience, an app store or access to other bits of technology, a data foundation, and a kind of intelligence layer.
Yeah.
And I think that sums it up quite well, particularly when you go back to what you were saying about ultimately what you need to provide to the organisation, to the buyers and to the suppliers is a good experience. And it doesn't matter whether there are different pieces of technology that they're going through.
A good experience that solves the problem you were trying to solve in the first place, because I think that's obviously the critical bit as well.
Yeah, there's no point in just having a nice time.
But if it solves a problem, people can live with a slightly poorer experience of that, and then it's about how do you improve that over time. But is this actually making my life easier? So a lot of users from a source to pay platform, they just want to buy something, so they just want it to be
get on with it.
Extremely, they just want to be able to, all I want is, I want to go work, I've got an outcome I'm looking for, I want to work with a provider to drive that outcome. Please make this as easy as you can possibly make it. So actually, when we get into everything from different control points, and you get into different thresholds, and you get into different workflows, they're not really interested in any of that. Some of it is obviously necessary just because of governance and controls within organisations. So, but it's just having that balance between, but something different, like I don't know, a supplier collaboration tool where I can go crowdsource problems and actually be able to bring suppliers in from a different ecosystem to manage that, is solving a real problem for me, or a tool that then gives me end-to-end transparency of everything, where it is and how it's progressing and what I need to do, is solving a problem for me. And so it's those things where I think really trying to think about what is the problem we're trying to solve. And I think going back, it would have been difficult. If you go back 10 years, it would have been difficult often for procurement teams to offer that, because the marketplace wasn't there, the technology wasn't there, there was probably lots of some good thinking. And obviously, I guess probably going back, when Cooper first came into the market, they obviously disrupted things in the source to pay environment a lot. But in that last 10 years, we've then seen disruption after disruption after disruption. But I think that needs more intelligence, the wrong word, but
it needs strategic thought, doesn't it?
It is, but I did say earlier, I don't really like saying I want to be strategic, but it needs people with the breadth of thinking where you could understand the art of the possible is probably the best way to put it. It's understanding the art of the possible, understanding these are the problems we're trying to solve, understanding how that digital layer solves those problems, and this is how I'm going to then fit all this together so it actually solves the problem and it provides a great experience for people. And that is not easy, is the reality. I mean, if anyone has got it mastered and they've managed to do every single piece, then I'm very interested in having those conversations, because it's not easy. And it's not easy the more complex your organization, the more legacy you've got in your organization. So you've got in terms of legacy platforms, and if you've got lots of on-premise, it's difficult to do. And that's why we end up having all these conversations like we're having now about these things. It's not because everybody sits in there and it's easy and everyone's nailed it. It's because there are challenges within it. And so you do need the right people who are having that thinking of how we're joining all this together.
Yeah, and I mean, the procurement technology landscape has accelerated and grown rapidly. There's massive investment going into it.
Yep.
When you look at it compared to like marketing technology, it's still small and it's going to get a lot bigger. But how do you like to kind of be made aware about new technologies? Because there's loads of innovation happening, there's cool stuff coming out, but when you start looking at market maps and things like that, it's generally a bit of a brain melting type exercise. So clearly you're super busy, your team are busy.
I'm honestly quite open to, so I'm sure there's lots of people contact me on LinkedIn who I've not responded to who would disagree with this, but I probably do take a lot of the cold call emails. I do take a lot of quick demos, and I wouldn't say I spend huge amounts of time, but I quite often will do 20-25 minutes with companies who got in contact just to say, well, just show me, right, what are you actually, what's your offering, what's the solution, what does that look like? I guess I'm quite interested. So I was at, when you're talking about the conversations with Lance, so when they launched the ProcureTech 100, I was there with them at that, and so kind of understanding the angle that they were taking from that perspective. I probably sort of build that network, so you're having those conversations and people are making you aware of the new tools. But Cooper was a good example. Came off a cold call. Nobody knew who they were at the time. I got a cold call from, they had only an agent at the time. They ended up having one employee at the time when we signed up in Europe, but it was actually through an agent who, at the time, I said, never heard of it, what is it? Okay, come and talk to me about it. And then the conversation grew from there. So I do try and be as open as possible. Clearly, time constraints are sometimes that you do end up with a lot of things in your LinkedIn inbox, and I'm not always totally on top of them, but it's really about network. It's really about being, I guess, why I enjoy the transformation. It's the curiosity to what's the art of the possible, how do I then be creative and sort of more entrepreneurial, if you like, in terms of how do I develop that. So as a result, you need to sort of know what's out there, and it's not all about the platforms that you've already known. It's about what else is coming. And I was one of the judges actually on Procurement 100, so that was quite useful as well. So I was looking at all the contracting tools, but you obviously then dug into them a lot more in terms of different solutions. And Lance described me last week as quite outspoken on these things, so I don't know if that was a compliment.
Made an impact.
Yeah. So, but it was really like, well, okay, fine, but what's a USP? Because I know 6 other technologies that do this. What is it you're trying to sell me, and how does that look? And if it is good, and it's like, oh, actually, that's really cool, then we'll further those conversations because I'm interested. And interested, actually, when we're talking about the advisory piece, in supporting some of those organisations as well moving forward. And because obviously I've got a level of knowledge on what I think does work in organisations and what doesn't. And I know the market pretty well in terms of where I think gaps are. And it's not like I've done source to pay, I've done supplier management, I've done risk, I've done contracting. So I've kind of done all the different elements to an extent. So it's also actually working with some of those organisations and trying to provide some input that hopefully enhances their solutions as well.
Yeah, I think, what you say about gaining that awareness of what's out there, I do think it's really important. Clearly, you're very busy. Time constraints need to be taken into consideration. But that's where I think with things like what Lance is doing with ProcureTech, where he's curating credible platforms, and building up that kind of network of what's out there and who's in the conversation. I think it's really useful. Events, I think are a good mode of communication for that sort of thing as well, because people are in that kind of open environment.
Well, and obviously that is then becoming more open. So again, I said that to Lance last week in terms of, I think they've done some good things since he set ProcureTech up, and they're doing some work with saw in the market in terms of the work they're doing with Jaguar Land Rover in terms of sort of
accelerator,
and so obviously progress. Obviously, DPW only started a couple of years ago, but I was at the first DPW, and that kind of has obviously got some real acceleration there. So I think there are more and more places and networks where you can get that learning, but I think you need to create the time and you need to be interested. If I'm honest, that's the big thing. Where the big thing for me is, because the way I work is I want to try and learn something new, and you want to try and improve things, then I'm always interested to have those conversations. If you just get into, I just haven't got time because I'm in a meeting from 8 o'clock till 6 o'clock, then actually you're always going to be in that position because you're not creating the time to do it. I'm a Liverpool fan, and I was at the Liverpool.
Oh, must have been a fairly good week for you then.
I was at the game. I was at Anfield at the weekend.
Were you?
Yeah, so I was at the match. So yes, it was a happy Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, I bet.
With the 7-0 victory against Manchester United. Any Manchester United fan, yeah. But I was with my brother, and he was talking about, because he's sort of come out of corporate life now, but he was talking about just kind of the difference of being in a more advisory VC type activities, and just the difference in terms of meetings, where I think we're sort of saying the sort of biggest cultural issue in organisations is just scheduled meeting. I think you obviously need to get yourself out of that, where there obviously are meetings that are critical, but I think you need to get to the point where you are creating the headspace to be able to think about things, and that you are trying to constantly learn. None of it, the worst position you can ever be in is where you don't think you've got anything else to learn, because ultimately we all have. It doesn't matter how long we've been doing this, it doesn't matter what our roles are, from CPO to procurement analyst and everything else in between. The reality is they've all got things to learn, and it's more about how do I create that time, and how do I create an infrastructure and that sort of ecosystem around me where I've got the opportunity to do that. And sometimes, like I said, I'm pretty good, I think, at taking the sort of cold call, where particularly if it's of something of interest. If it's something where it's
relevant,
not relevant to me, then okay, fine, I'm probably as bad as everyone else at just ignoring the messages that come in. But I think if there are things there where I think, well, actually, I can see a real opportunity here, then I'm interested in having that conversation. And nothing might come of it for 6 months or a year or 2 years, because you've got to. It's all about what we talked about earlier, having the business problem. But in order to solve the business problem with the technology, you need to understand the technology is the reality, and you need to understand what's out there. Then the eureka moment comes in with, we've got a problem. That solution that I talked about previously, which that's why I mentioned the sort of workflow tools that are starting to come in, where I do think there is a real gap there of everybody struggles with the end-to-end, and they struggle with really looking at providing that transparency and providing the user experience. And I think there are definitely some solutions now starting to look at that as a real problem to solve. And I think it is a real problem to solve. I think most organizations will have done it, where even if you've done the best end-to-end implementation, there's still bits where, we can give that, but then you'll have to go to a help desk for this, and you'll have to go that way. And so I think having had those conversations, you start to whir things around in your mind and really think of that, the art of the possible, and therefore might not be for another 6 months or a year, or where you're having conversations where that becomes useful. But just having that in your mind, I think, is very useful, very helpful to have.
Yeah, I think with what you were saying about the kind of, you can't just be stuck in meetings all the time, and you've got to know what's out there. You've got to understand both sides of the equation. What does the business need? What are the opportunities within that technology landscape? But it kind of comes back to what you're talking about around curiosity. If you're naturally, that way inclined, you're going to want to, well, what are people doing? How are people saying they're making things better? Is that true?
Yeah.
But it's also that ability to take a step back every now and again and keep coming back to the strategy. Which is such an important thing for any size of business. For a kind of like a tech startup, scale-up type business, it's absolutely critical to always come back to what's your strategy, how are you addressing that, and not just get caught up in the rapids of what's going on a day-to-day basis. But it applies to big companies as well. And I think when you're talking about aligning with strategy, I still think a lot of big companies just don't either have their strategy lined up effectively or don't communicate it effectively. But that's a kind of separate conversation. But one of the other things I wanted to come back to was when you're talking about kind of getting this broader picture, we're starting to have a lot more conversations with, for example, procurement excellence functions. I think that's really interesting in terms of the way that side of things is developing, in terms of understanding the wider infrastructure and just looking at it from a pure problem-solving exercise of how does this process and technology all knit together.
I mean, it's to me. So anybody who's listening who wants to be a CPO, I would massively say that's the area that you should go and work in, because I think it's where you are closest to all of the touch points and all of the end-to-end elements. So in terms of when I was at the pharma organisation, the person who did that role for me is now CPO in that organisation. The person who's done that role at Santander is now the CPO in that organisation. In terms of so it's kind of, for me, it's always the first role that I try and get somebody in place, because it's absolutely critical. Because the way I've always described it is the categories will deliver the value, but they're enabled by, we always call it the capabilities, but whether it's procurement excellence capabilities, they're enabled by that, and they can't work effectively and they can't really drive the value unless the whole ecosystem works together. And ultimately that comes within that procurement excellence area, and actually what's our proposition, how are we positioning ourselves, how are we performing, how are we measuring that, what's our tech roadmap look like, what we're digitizing, how are we managing risk. All of that comes into it, and you've got some multiple touch points and a lot of complexity within that. So it's kind of, if people have got that career trajectory they're looking for, I would massively encourage people to look in that area, because it really sort of then opens up your mind and opens the perspective on all the different elements of procurement, not just I'm sat in a category and I'm going to drive huge value, which are obviously important, and they're the people out managing business partnership. And under our category areas, we had supplier collaboration roles within there, so it's certainly not saying that they're not critical, because actually that's where they're the front face, if you like. But that middle and back office is just as important as getting that front office correct.
Yeah, it feels like a central leverage point again.
Massively.
So the last area I really wanted to kind of touch on was just specifically around data. I know you said you're very kind of numeracy is an important thing. It's kind of part of how your mind works. You did an economics degree, is that right? So when you look at the numbers,
time ago that though, Johnny. I mean, I'm not going to start getting
back in the day. Oh, don't. Always reminds me of when I was at university studying environmental biology, and one of my mates who was studying economics wheeled out a copy of The Economist and said, Johnny, why don't you look up your degree in there in terms of what the likely earnings are by doing that degree against the average earnings? And economics was like a plus 70% or something like that. And my degree was something like minus 9%. I was like, okay, I see. Hopefully it would be slightly more valued these days. But so on the data side, how do you think that data is going to change procurement? Obviously, there's a lot of data already, but I'm kind of interested in how you think it's going to change it in terms of how can procurement get more data? How can it get better data? What type of work is that going to mean that people need to do within procurement? And also, what kind of talent does that mean that procurement need to have in that area? And the last kind of bit around it is, what does that mean for the relationship with the wider business? Because one of the things that I think you've talked about is kind of positioning and selling into the rest of the business. Mm-hmm. Surely that's always easier if you've got data to back it up.
So I think it comes back to that whole repositioning and reimagining what procurement is. I think in previous roles we kind of explained to people in terms of the direction we were going, and through either some outsourcing of some activities or then automation of activities. And I think you end up with people who are in two camps on that. You end up with the person who thinks, well, this is terrible because this is my job, and what's my job actually going to be? And you end up with the people who think, well, this is a massive opportunity for me, because actually running RFPs and running some of the simple negotiations and getting involved in some of the more administrative tasks is not what I enjoy in procurement. What I enjoy is how am I working with supplier partners, how am I working with business partners in order to drive those business outcomes. And so in terms of really, I guess it brings into the technology conversation, but data becoming a critical part of that. To me, it's all about how we create in that time and headspace in order for us to be able to really drive the business partnerships and drive the supply partnerships, which the more that you can automate, the more that you can then start to create that data ecosystem that actually starts to bring, and it's not, to me, it's not about the data, it's about the insights that we come from that data. I think people, again, can get lost in that, saying, look, we've got all this data. It's like, yeah, but what are we actually doing with it? And that's the critical bit. It's the insights that starts to come from that. And ultimately, I guess, knowledge is power, and therefore being able to really bring those insights and to be able to drop those nuggets in and to be able to have coherent strategies that are based on data are obviously absolutely critical, and will become more and more critical as teams spend less of their time doing the traditional, let's call it category management, sourcing activities, more time on actually how am I building the supplier and business partnerships and bringing those together and managing this ecosystem. Data is going to be critical within that, about how is that being used to drive value for the organization. And it massively helps that repositioning, because you are then bringing huge amounts of credibility, as opposed to you're doing a task, which I guess, to me, running an RFP and running a sourcing event is a task ultimately. You're actually focused on business outcomes that you're trying to drive, and you're able to base that in a structured, coherent manner based on the data insights that's become available, and then you become a real source of knowledge within the organization. And I think that's the critical element, and that's where time, I think, take COVID as that piece, where time, people realised, was probably the most critical asset that we have, and we're all time poor. So actually, how do you create more and more in order to be able to understand the supplier ecosystem, understand what your business partners are looking for, understand the art of the possible of how we simplifying and automating the sort of more mundane, and how we really understanding the complex as well. So how we really starting to, which obviously then data fits very neatly into that complex about, but that's where I said you do have to take that step back as well and look at your whole digital landscape and how does it all fit together, because it only all works if the data is able to flow and you're able to see the total end-to-end picture, as opposed to this point in time and then this data set doesn't match that data set and I'm trying to crunch them together and I've got no way of doing that. So it does take a lot of, like I said, it takes a lot of time, effort, but I think it will naturally evolve operating models. So a good example is what we did at Santander, where and I'm not saying this is right, to be honest, whether we've got it right and whether it will evolve, but about 40% of our team are either focused on supplier collaboration or risk,
right?
Because it was really focused on what are the needs of this organisation. Where do I think this organisation needs to go? Because what a financial services organisation needed 10 years ago to what a financial services organisation needs in 5 years' time from a supplier ecosystem is very, very different. Obviously, moving away from bricks and mortar into a more digital world, and therefore the supply base that you need is obviously different. So actually we focused on what do we need from an operating model to be able to work with that, to deliver that, to manage that. And I think that will be a critical element where people move away from this sort of supersonic category manager who does a bit of everything and picks up risk in the morning and supply management in the afternoon and a bit of sourcing tomorrow morning, to actually more structured division of responsibility. What does that data team start to look like? How we really driving insights from that data team? So obviously there is a specific skill set. We talked about the colours earlier, where you've got people who are, so whether it's data scientists but how that starts to build it up, but you need to be able to create the environment where that data becomes available, and then it's actually how do we turn that into the insight which helps drive some of the other activities, whether it be through business partnerships, whether it be through supplier partnerships, but actually how does that all fit together? And I think that's the critical element. And data's one element of that. I think there'll be others as well, but it is really about sort of taking away the simple, if you like, and automate as much as possible and really start to understand that complex area in a much greater level of detail. And as a result, I've said this a few times, so apologies for people who've listened, but you are what you eat. And actually if you create an organisation that's got half a person doing some data on a Friday night, then you're not going to have some great data insights. So, and it's the same with risk, and it's the same with ESG, and it's the same with supplier collaboration. You've got to really put your money where your mouth is and start to put the right people and what skills does that person need, because they won't be the same person who was up 5 years ago doing a category manager role for me. But I think you need to think about what we're here to do, think about what our value proposition is, and then think about where you're trying to get to, and then make sure the operating model fits with that and you've got the right people doing the right things.
Yeah, it all has to come back to the bigger picture, as you say. So I'm going to wrap things up there, but and that's been really, really super interesting. I really appreciate it. Just a kind of a point of intrigue from my angle with what you're doing, obviously with the way that your roles have evolved in terms of becoming this kind of taking this problem-solving angle that comes in at a certain point and solves the problem. So that's one of the things that's kind of influenced how your career has gone through to this point. And obviously with what you're doing at Santander, it's really interesting the fact that you're taking that from an advisory point of view. When you look at the future of where what you're doing is going, where the industry is going, where the technology is heading, all these different things you mentioned about, the fact that you have a good understanding and you can work with the technology providers as well. What do you see as the key things in the future that you want to leverage personally?
For me, this is like a psychiatrist.
I want to really get into the depth there.
So for me, I think I've probably got to a point in my career, and again, this is where I think the advisory piece fits in. I want to do things where you can make a difference and you can see the skills that I have, the strengths we talked about earlier, where A, you can see the challenge, but B, you can make a real rapid impact. And I think it also has to have some sort of purpose in terms of why I'm actually doing that and what it's bringing into the wider environment or a specific organisation or specific industry. I think having that sort of purpose is really quite important to me now. And again, whether it's just a bit older and a bit more experienced with it, but it has to have that. It's kind of clearly we've all got to pay the bills and and we've got to there is an income element we have to bring into it. But for me, having that wider purpose is really important, and really thinking that I can make a difference. I would hate just going in where you're just taking your income and then just doing a mundane and not really challenging yourselves and not really being able to make that impact. I think that's the critical thing for me. So it's really working with the right people who've got the right mindset and really seeing what that problem is and really focus on what the art of the possible is, and then really trying to enhance that value. And that value obviously comes in many different ways, whether it be through responsible procurement agenda, whether it be through risk, whether it be through cost, there's a million and one different reasons. And it's that sort of whole value proposition that really sort of interests and excites me moving forward. But I think they're the key things from my perspective. It's the sort of purpose, it's the how can I make things better here, and how can I really make an impact, because that's kind of what motivates me, particularly I guess where I am in my career and life at the moment.
I'm very much on board with what you're saying. It's all about having a clear purpose, a clear goal, and just getting things done.
Why do I get out of bed in the morning?
Yeah.
Why do I work? Why do I do the work that I do? And I think that is probably, there's more to that than simply, well, I need to pay the mortgage ultimately. And it's looking at all of those fundamentals together, and how can I just use that to drive myself on.
Yeah, it has to be that reason to get out of bed in the morning that isn't just that one of your kids are up and they've woken you up, or that the dog needs to go for a walk or something like that.
Yeah. Totally.
They're all there as well, though.
Yeah.
Excellent stuff. Well, listen, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat. Really enjoyed that. I think some great insights that come out of it, and I like the fact that we've been able to go off on a few tangents and delve into some of the experiences you had. But
kind of the way my brain works, it goes off on those tangents, hence why I like transformation.
Excellent stuff. Well, yeah, it's been really great, and thanks very much for coming in. Right. And hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Cool. All right, thanks, Johnny.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.